Hey everyone, welcome back to a new video. Before I begin on the stories, I just wanted to mention, if you have your own personal scary story that you would like to send me for me to possibly narrate here on the channel, you can do so by sending it to southerncannibal.com. So if you have a personal true scary story that you'd like to share, please consider sending it my way. Now that all that's out of the way, let's begin. Today is the 17th anniversary following the events of August 29, 2005, known as Hurricane Katrina. This story is my experience going through this event as a child while living on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. To put things in perspective, the eye of the storm passed over a town I lived 30 minutes away from, and this event changed everyone's life. I wanted to share this story in memory of all those who lost their lives, and I wanted to spread awareness about evacuating for dangerous storms. I was 7 years old when the storm hit. I remember being packed into the car and retreating to North Mississippi about 3 hours from the coast to stay with my grandparents. Even up there, the effects of the storm were bad. The trees swayed and cracked, falling and breaking. The wind was so loud, and it stormed while we were there. I remember the power going out for days, and we slept in the hallway on an air mattress in the heat. After the storm passed, we returned home to assess the damage of the house, and for my parents to check on their jobs. They're both emergency workers, and they weren't supposed to leave the area, but chose to do so anyway because of their kids, us. We were young, and they were scared for us to stay because we lived a mile away from the beach. I remember coming back, and my parents drove by our grandma's first. There was a whole tree that had fallen through the center of her home, and she was nowhere to be found. Cell phones didn't have service at the time because all phone lines had been knocked down in the area. Thankfully, she had evacuated at the last minute and was safely located later. But at the time, my parents didn't know if she was even dead or alive. We drove to our parents' jobs, and I remember the whole parking lot of the hospital where my mom worked being filled with stretchers and covered with white sheets to what I now realize was dead bodies. But to my 7-year-old mind, I didn't pay that much attention to them. While my mom was in the middle of talking to someone, this lady emerged from the crowd, being carried by several men. This captivated my attention. She was screaming and holding her arms in the air, soaked with blood. She was unable to put them down. People whispered that she had survived the storm by holding onto a tree for more than 24 hours as the storm ripped its way through town. I was transfixed on this woman, and the image of seeing her holding her arms in the air and screaming is something I still think about from time to time. After this, my parents took us to see the damage of our own home. We found large tree branches laying everywhere and piled against our windows. Going inside for the first time after was crazy. Our home had flooded during the storm, and the floors were ruined and soaked with mud and stagnant water. It was so hot inside, and it smelled stale, dirty. My mother took a large kitchen pot and then filled it with leftover bottled water so that she could bathe my brother and me. That night we had dinner by the candlelight, the only lights to illuminate the darkness that had filled our powerless home. We had MRE meals that my dad had saved from his job, and after dinner, my mom put me to sleep on the couch with her, while my dad slept on my brother's bunk bed with him. The next day, we were leaving at the crack of dawn because my mother couldn't take it anymore. With any spare gas from cans in the garage she could find, she filled the car, and she loaded my brother and I with a bag each full of clothes and one toy each. My father stayed behind to try and start cleaning and repairing the damage done to the house, while my mom drove north to her cousin's house so we could stay in a proper home. Luckily, her cousin didn't suffer any damage from the storm other than lost power, but a generator kept the home functioning. There at her house, my mom surprisingly reunited with my grandmother, who had been hoping we would arrive. We stayed for a couple of nights, and then the whole family decided we were getting away from the state. There was no gas, and people were out of work everywhere at the time. The stores were out of food, and my family knew that we couldn't survive for long. So after a few days, everyone packed their cars with clothes and drove on what little gas was left to leave the state. We were like a military convoy almost. A line of back-to-back cars that communicated via walkie-talkie radios, stopping only for gas. They drove for 18 hours until we reached the state of Missouri, where more of my family lived, and where the effects of Katrina had not penetrated. Everyone found work in Missouri, and we all lived in a hotel for a while so my dad could fix up our home. Our house had to be completely gutted due to the flooding. Returning back home to Mississippi after the house was gutted was a complete change. What was once a beautiful and comfortable home was now a gutted house with concrete floors and bath towels for privacy doors. I slept on a twin mattress on the floor of my room, and I watched TV on patio furniture chairs in the living room with my brother. We lived this way for a while, until we were finally able to get a FEMA trailer for several months until the house was built back properly. When school finally started again, I found myself back in an environment that was forever changed. Some people I'd grown up with had drowned and actually died. A friend of mine who stayed rode the storm out with her family in the attic, with the water up to their necks. Another friend of mine was swept out of his home by a current, and a stranger swimming by pulled him into a tree for safety, before disappearing under the water, never to be seen again. My father's friend dove off the third-story window of his beach house in a canoe in order to survive. My great-grandmother and grandfather rode out the storm on the roof of the local courthouse while watching their cars float away into the sea. So many people died drowning while trapped in their homes. So many people are still missing and unaccounted for after all this time. I'm sorry this story is a bit long, but please, if you've stuck around to listen, always evacuate. The reality of staying behind could be so much worse, and it could leave you with traumas that you'll never forget. This is my story. My name is Kara. I'm a junior in high school, and I'm 16 years old. Just to get some background info, my schedule consists of me going to 2 different schools every day. I go to my regular school for my first 2 periods, and a school to the town right next to me for the last 2. I do this because there's a special program I take for the school that's in a different town. It was homecoming week for our school, so it was a very happy time. People were very excited this year for homecoming, like me, because since of the lockdown last year, we didn't have a homecoming last year. My friends in class were saying that there was going to be a big storm headed our way in our hometown. At the time, I was at the school that's in a different town than mine. I remember hearing on the intercom that we were leaving early because of the storm, so I got into the bus and head back to my home school. The bus driver had decided to take the back roads instead of the highway because the rain was starting to pick up fast. I remember we stopped somewhere in the middle of nowhere for 30 minutes, and the rain and thunder got very bad. We found out there was a tornado directly above our home school, and everyone was hiding doing a tornado drill, while other people from my class and I were stuck on a bus in the middle of nowhere. I started to freak out, so I called my mom. She told me to calm down and that I was overreacting, but in reality, I was scared shitless. The rain kept getting heavier and heavier, and the bus driver started driving again. After we got to our school, my mom picked me up, and we decided to go around to see the damage the tornado did. The tornado took down a power line and ended up landing on top of my home school, and big trees were also down, along with the road signs, power lines, and you get the gist. I didn't think a tornado could ever be taken so seriously. Just be careful and try to be somewhere safe during a tornado. Hey Southern Cannibal, I'm a 21-year-old female. and I've been watching your videos for nearly 2 years now. This is honestly a very long story, and I don't know if you even do videos on natural disaster scary stories, but I thought I would try and send mine in and see if it makes it into a video. This was a very traumatic event for me, and I felt like writing what I experienced along with some of the facts will help get some of it off my shoulders. Now, for some of the facts about that night, December 10th, 2021 was a date that will live in the history books in the weather world. A record-breaking, life-ending, 1-mile-wide monster of a tornado made its way over 160 miles of America and was in contact with the ground for nearly 3 hours straight. It ranged between an EF2 and an EF5, with it being a 4 out of 5 most of the time, and having wind speeds between 116 to 200 miles per hour. It reportedly killed 89 people and injured 672, with the victims including the elderly all the way down to the youngest victim that night being a baby girl of just 3 months. Now for my personal story. I live in Mayfield, Kentucky, working as a shift manager at a grocery store that isn't very big. I was at work doing a 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. closing shift on the day of the tornado. I've always had major anxiety when it comes to storms or tornadoes, and I knew that night would be really bad by the way my local weathermen were talking about it. Noah Bregwin and Trent Okerson for the WPSD Local 6 weather station. Noah being quoted saying, "If you have a helmet, get it on. Get to a safe place." Then reiterating things like they were not trying to scare us, but inform us that the storm would be very different than anything we've ever experienced in this area, and that we needed to take it seriously and try to save our lives if we were in the path. So I, being the anxious person I was glued to my phone all day, watching the Facebook Live the weather station was having, and making sure I knew what time the storm would be in my area so I could get my staff out early enough to get home or to their safe place before things went down. Originally, the storm would be in my area around 10:30 p.m. that night, which was great because I could just make sure we all left right after closing the store at 9 p.m. and everyone would have more than enough time to get home and get prepared. But then, as the night went on, the storm was moving so fast that it would hit my area at about 9:30 p.m. This made things harder, but everyone who worked that night lived in town or very close, so we still had time to all get home. 9 p.m. comes around and I close the store, and I text my boss, telling her she'll have to crush the rest of our empty boxes in the morning because the machine we used to crush them was full, and I wasn't making us stay any later to empty it when they could do it in the morning for us. Little did I know it wouldn't even get done until a week later when we finally reopened. As you should have been able to tell by that sentence, our store didn't get destroyed, but the other side of town closer to my house was not nearly as lucky. But we all leave right after 9 p.m. and tell all of my associates to text me when they get home, and we'll all check on each other when this is over. My husband picks me up and we head home. About 5 minutes later, we're turning up down our street, and I get a notification on my Apple Watch from the local weather station's app with a phrase that I've never seen before, as I then read the all-capitalized bold alert. "Tornado emergency. A disastrous tornado has entered Mayfield. Take cover now." The city's tornado siren starts blaring, and the little wind we had dies down to nothing. Like many of you may know, people use the phrase "the calm before the storm" to refer to this time before a tornado happens, and it cannot be trusted to mean the storm is not going to be as bad. I, being the mess I am, start crying, and I then tell my husband to run all of the stop signs on our street if nobody was there, and to get us home as fast as possible. We eventually get home, where my in-laws, my husband's grandma, his brother and 2 sisters are all waiting, and I run into my room to change into normal clothes and make sure to have my phone, wallet, and anything very important that I can put into my backpack to take with us while we hunker down in the crawl space under the house. The crawl space was actually large, We could sit up in it, and it was basically the entire under part of the house. At the time, we didn't realize this was a bad idea because if the house fell, we'd be crushed under it. But we got very lucky that we didn't end up dying that night, like so many others. We get it together, and it gets even more quiet, and all we hear is the tornado sirens, and the air is filled with static and pressure, which you can feel. We run to the crawl space hole, and as we're getting in it, it starts to hail. My husband sits next to me and his brother, and my mother-in-law sits with the two girls and my husband's grandma, while my father-in-law holds up this little twin-size bed to the hole because it doesn't actually have a way to close us in there, and to also keep anything from being thrown in with us. So we're all sitting there under the house, and I call my mom who lives in a town 30 minutes away from us, and I tell her what we're doing and what's happening. All of a sudden, we start feeling a rumble on the ground, and the wind outside starts to pick up quickly. I tell my mom what's happening, and we hear a big crash nearby, and the house above us starts to shake. I tell my mom over the phone, "I think something hit the house." Then the call drops, and later I find out that my mom had told my dad that she thought that would be the last time she ever talked to me again, because she couldn't get a hold of me after that. So then the wind roars and the ground is shaking. It's shaking in a way that I can only compare to a train about to hit our house. And my father-in-law then screams to my husband, "Help me! Please help me! I can't hold it!" While the bed he was holding was being sucked out of the door, and they all screamed at all of us, "Get back! Get back! Back up!" And I can see the both of them struggling to hold the mattress in place. I was honestly terrified, thinking they would get sucked out. My mother-in-law was holding on to the two girls, and me and my brother-in-law have our arms closest to each other, locked together, just in case the house gets ripped away from on top of us. I look at my husband, and I tell him I love him, and he says it back, even though I can't hear him. Me thinking this would be the last time I would ever be with any of them was the worst feeling I've ever had. Before this event, I was wary in my faith, and I don't know how everyone feels about religion, but that night, I was praying to God to just let me and my family live. That I would do anything if he could just protect my family and let us live. After about 5 to 10 minutes, that actually felt more like an hour, everything calmed down. Then my first thought after being so thankful we were all alive was that I hoped our large tree in the front yard hadn't hit the house and killed our two female dogs, a small red terrier and an old chocolate lab, which we had put in the bathroom as it was the safest room for them and we couldn't bring them down with us. We sat down there for another 10 minutes just to make sure everything was good, and we then hear sirens from the police and medics as well as firemen everywhere outside. Once we open the door to come out, we then see that 4 of our large backyard trees had fallen and nearly trapped us down there. We all get out and see the house was intact and our dogs were okay. But the boom and shaking we heard was a huge branch that landed on our back porch and destroyed it. But our mercy was the roof my father-in-law had built on the back porch prevented the branch from breaking our back sliding glass door that led into the kitchen. After getting out from under the house, I see that the 6 or so fences between my yard and the next 3 houses down my street are all flat on the ground, and my elderly neighbor, who was in her 90s, her bag glass door was shattered. Me and my husband go see if she's okay, and we find that her roof is intact, but her ceiling inside her kitchen was caved, and insulation was everywhere. We find her and her dog, and we bring them to our house to try and find her cat, but to no avail. Thankfully the next day, however, she had found her cat hiding under a couch, which we think she hid from us until we left. It's now been about 20 minutes since the tornado, and I start trying to get in contact with my parents to let them know I'm okay. I try to call them, but their electricity at home had gone out due to the storms in their area. Not the tornado, just the storms from the outside of it, and they can't get calls without Wi-Fi. They have Text Now, which is a free Wi-Fi only calling and texting app. So I try to call my grandma because the storm was heading her way now. and I wanted to warn her. After talking to her and finding out that they were okay and it wasn't hitting them directly, I then called my brother because he lived close to my parents, and through tears I choked out, "Please, I need you to go to Mom and Dad's house and have them call me. The tornado just came through Mayfield, and I was on the phone with Mom, but it cut off after I told her something hit the house, and I don't want her to think that I died. I haven't been able to get a hold of them, and I need them to know I'm okay." Just writing that out still makes me choke up and tear up a little. Now especially, knowing that my mom actually thought the last words she would ever hear from me were, "I think something hit the house." But obviously he agrees to go, and I'm waiting by the phone when I finally see his name pop up again, and I start crying and answer the phone. "Mom?" I then hear my mom bawling on the other end to my dad, saying I'm okay, and I tell her what happened, and then I go so that I can figure out what we're gonna do next. I get inside and I sit with my husband in our room, and we just hold each other, asking if we're okay and saying we're so glad we're okay. Things that you would say to your partner after you both almost died. I start seeing pictures posted of my town's current state, and I can't believe my eyes. A lot of the major buildings like the courthouse, the Hall Hotel, and others were all destroyed, and I'm hearing of so many people's houses that are also gone. I finally fall asleep around midnight, and I then wake up at 3 a.m. to a text from a coworker that one of the guys I worked with that night had passed away. It looked like last minute he decided to try and get out, and he was packing some stuff and his dog into his truck, but then a tree swept him up and he died. They only knew this because they found him. He lived with their dad as his roommate, and they went to check on their dad because they couldn't get a hold of him, and they found them both outside, and they both unfortunately had passed away. My coworker dying gave me a major case of survivor's guilt because I blamed myself for being so worried about leaving that day and making sure we all got home. And I was telling myself if we had gotten stuck at work, he would have been fine, which if we had stayed, he would have actually been fine. But I now know that it wasn't my fault, and if I wanted everyone to stay at work, I knew that he wouldn't have, because all day he was talking about his pit bull at home and how he was wanting to get her and hunker down. While trying to get to sleep again and mostly failing, I hear that 2 stores, the liquor store and a pharmacy, were being looted by people since they got destroyed and stuff was everywhere. This and the fact that for about a week after this event, there were reports of people looting destroyed houses late at night when it was literally pitch black outside besides the faint light of the moon. I cannot tell you how incredibly dark it gets at night when literally the entire city has no power. It was actually quite terrifying to look out the door or windows and not even be able to see the end of my front yard to let the dogs out to potty without a flashlight. Also, we had an outdoor cat that we thought passed away, but 3 days after the tornado, he appears out of nowhere with a little bit of a limp, but nothing else, and we were so grateful. But anyways, I finally fall back to sleep at like 4 a.m. and wake up at about 6:30 a.m. I just decided to get up because I notice it's light outside, and I leave my sleeping husband to walk outside, and I can't believe my eyes. You could see some destruction around my house at night, but when it was light out, and the house 3 doors down had been destroyed by a tree the night before, I had heard the fire rescue using chainsaws to cut the tree apart to get the mother and her 3 terrified kids out of the house. Me and my brother-in-law decided to walk down the street to see in person what had happened from all of the pics we saw on friends' social medias the night before. As we're walking, we can't even recognize our street. Houses are destroyed and leveled, and in one house lived a woman that I used to work with. The roof had collapsed on them, sparing her and her older son, but killing her younger son, who was only like 3 or 4 years old. Streets were lined with downed power lines, bricks, and trees everywhere. And then, we made it to the court square. Now, that was crazy to see. Our court square had a tall part of it that came to a peak, with a bell at the top, kind of like a lot of churches around here. That had come down overnight, and it was laying in the front yard and smashed everything in its way down. The police station across the street had all of its windows smashed in, and just about every building in that area was barely standing or just reduced to a scattered pile of rubble that you couldn't even try to piece it back together to make a building again. I'll try to wrap this up quick now since we're through the main stuff, but the weeks following the tornado were wild. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked to our town to help. A group of men were going around town cutting up trees, and they came up to us a few days after the event, and they cut up all 5 trees that lay in our yard. And they even piled up all the wood near the road where the city had told everyone to, so they could easily pick up the mounding piles of what was left of people's lives. Groups offered assistance in the forms of clothes and food. People in Mayfield who hadn't been affected by the tornado directly helped those groups bring food to people and give people heaters and blankets as well. We were hoping to have power by Christmas, but we got our own little late Christmas miracle when 2 days after Christmas, we see a man working on a telephone pole they had just set up, and then bam, we had power again. 2 weeks after the tornado, I was finally able to work again, with it being a few days after they reopened, but I needed a few more days to take care of some stuff, since I was the only one who worked there who lived right in the destruction path. Things were incredibly slow at first, since half the town wasn't even thinking of buying groceries at the time, and they couldn't even if they wanted to anyway, since they had no place to put them. But now as I write this, it's November 10th, 2022. In exactly 1 month, it will be the 1-year anniversary of that night, and things are still not back to normal. Our town still has debris randomly everywhere, even though the bulk of it is all gone. Most of our court square is empty, so you can see across half the town as all of the buildings affected have been taken down, but rebuilding is not started on most. Some houses have been rebuilt for free by a group of Christians, and a group of some Amish men as well, which was a blessing to those who lost their homes. But I'm just so incredibly grateful we didn't lose our house that night like so many others. But still, nearly a year later, our town is still reeling from that night, and they're not lying when they say it'll take years to get back to some sense of normal after a disaster like that. Now all we can do is just wait to see what happens with our little town.